It's the 27th of December, 2014, and this is episode 173. This show is intended for informational and educational purposes only. What cryptocurrency enables is new, empowering, and exciting, but we're not experts, just obsessed companions walking the road towards a more peer-to-peer future. Today we're finishing the AM/FM story with the final 4 parts. Enjoy! This is Radio Dreams Part 5, a selected reading from the Master Switch by Tim Wu, brought to you by the folks at Let's Talk Bitcoin. This section is called Radio Resistance. By the mid-1920s, it seemed likely, if not certain, that AT&T would dominate the radio industry. The firm held the all-important long lines, and its president, Walter Gifford, was aggressive and, in the mold of his predecessors, fond of conquest. The only thing standing in his way was a company that the US government had already sanctioned to monopolize radio, just as AT&T had been granted a warrant to rule telephones. And so the clash that was shaping up for the future of broadcasting would be, if not quite one of fellow titans, substantially different from the war Bell had waged earlier against his Lilliputian rivals in the telephone industry. We first encountered the Radio Corporation of America ringside at the boxing match in 1921, but this strange creature needs a better introduction via a few historical analogs. Structurally, the RCA was rather like the BBC, a national champion. But unlike the British company, it was neither established nor sustained with public duties. Rather, in 1919, the RCA was formed mainly in response to the Navy's insistence that all vital radio technologies be held by an American firm, in the interest of national security. And so RCA was fashioned out of the existing American Marconi Company to pool and exploit the rights to use more than 2,000 patents owned by General Electric, United Fruit, Westinghouse, and AT&T. In consideration for the licenses, General Electric was made a majority owner of RCA, but AT&T and Westinghouse also had substantial stakes. Hence, one of the odder features of the contest for broadcasting, AT&T was literally in a battle with its own property. RCA's general in the battle with AT&T was David Sarnoff, a genius of industrial combat also present at that boxing broadcast in 1921, who shall play a recurring role in this drama. Sarnoff was in mid-career, a rising star within RCA, when he was suddenly presented with a chance to take on AT&T and become the defining mogul of American broadcasting. The metaphor has been used before, but Sarnoff loved to imagine himself David confronting Goliath. For his part, AT&T's Gifford at first refused outright to negotiate with Sarnoff, whom he is said to have declared, quote, an abrasive Jew. While AT&T was a phone company first and foremost, it was also the larger and more aggressive of the two champions. It seemed to hold a decisive advantage, ownership of the network, the nation's only quality long-distance lines. Against AT&T, RCA would face some of the same problems of access and interconnection that had doomed the telephone independence in the 1910s. Let us pause to imagine what things might look like if Sarnoff had not been able to find a way to achieve what seemed impossible, and AT&T had won the battle for radio. Imagine that nearly every radio station and every radio set in America was AT&T's, along with every telephone and every wire. The power the phone company would have over American culture and communication is beyond comparison in the annals of democracy, comparable in structure only to what the fascists and communist regimes in Europe were creating at the time. But back to the story. Sarnoff needed a network to compete with AT&T, but there was no obvious way to get one. Despite its common carrier pledges, Bell denied any rival radio stations access to its wires. According to one Sarnoff biographer, a Bell executive told him, quote, transmission by wire is ours. Stay out of it. End quote. RCA did experiment with leasing parts of the lower quality telegraph network to carry programming, but the result was mostly just a loud buzz. And so, Sarnoff conceived a tactical shift. As mentioned earlier, AT&T was prohibited from manufacturing radio sets. It had signed an agreement with the RCA that said it has, quote, no license to make, lease, or sell wireless telephone receiving apparatus except as a part of or for direct use in connection with transmitting apparatus made by it, end quote. On the arguable ambiguity of that bit of legalese, Sarnoff decided to stake his company's future. Under the terms of the agreement, he brought a secret binding arbitration proceeding against AT&T, contending that its new radio sets violated the conditions of RCA's license pool. He was either lucky or a more astute reader of contractual language than other executives, for after hearings, the arbiters found not only that AT&T was violating the patent agreement by manufacturing radio sets, but that its broadcasting activities were flatly illegal as well. Unfortunately for AT&T, the arbiters' ruling coincided with losing another crucial lawsuit over the patent for a vacuum tube, without which they could no longer manufacture radio receivers or transmitting equipment at all. Topping off these woes, at about the same time, the Federal Trade Commission, a new agency created to enforce antitrust laws, launched an investigation into the radio industry. Obviously, AT&T had a lot to lose with another brush from the antitrust enforcers. Nonetheless, unwilling to concede defeat, the firm struck back with a report claiming violations of the statute on the part of RCA. The absurdity was lost on no one. AT&T, the state-sanctioned telephone monopoly, was accusing another state-sanctioned monopoly, RCA, of being an illegal trust with the transparent aim of blocking RCA for entering a market that RCA had created with the express cooperation of AT&T to exploit. This is not Adam Smith's vision of competition, not even Schumpeter's, but rather American industrial policy gone amok. And all of this maneuvering that could have so altered American communications and culture transpired behind the scrim of corporate confidentiality, not to be made public until scholarly investigation into the subject decades later. Despite its initial bravado, sometime in 1926, AT&T would lose its belly for the radio fight. The reasons have never been fully elucidated, but it's clear that by this time the opponents were caught in something of a prisoner's dilemma. One or the other side could have tried to gain the upper hand by going public with its charges, inviting the possibility of a long and costly federal lawsuit, or they could strike some kind of deal in secret. They chose the latter option. The two firms decided to work together on a new national broadcasting service based on Bell's NBS. AT&T would sell its network and stations to RCA, preserving its long-distance networking, while RCA took care of everything else. Though the settlement was in both firms' interests, there was no question but that AT&T had blinked, and the deal was a major victory for Sarnoff, who, just as Bell had done in scaring off Western Union in the 1870s, used the law to prevent AT&T from dominating radio completely. So, while radio was supposedly developing in the United States without direct government intervention, contrary to the British model, in fact, it was the case of two government-sponsored champions dueling over the same industrial prize in a decidedly unbloody bout. For in the end, AT&T's national broadcasting system never died, it just morphed a bit. Walter Gifford and David Sarnoff, finally on speaking terms, relaunched the entity under an almost imperceptibly different name, quote, announcing the National Broadcasting Company, NBC. The purpose of that company will be to provide the best programs available for broadcasting in the United States. The Radio Corporation of America is not in any sense seeking a monopoly of the air. It is seeking, however, to provide machinery which will ensure a national distribution of national programs and a wider distribution of programs of the highest quality. NBC was born, and with it, a new ideal of American broadcasting. This is Radio Dreams, Part 6, a selected reading from the book The Master Switch by Tim Wu that I highly recommend you go out and buy if you enjoy this story, as it includes a lot more that I'm not reading out loud. Part 6, A New American Model. Quote, commercialism is the heart of the broadcasting industry in the United States, wrote Harry Lafond, a commissioner of the Federal Radio Commission in 1931. By the 1930s, times had changed indeed in American radio. What was once a wide-open medium, mostly the province of amateur hobbyists, was now poised to become big business, dominated by a radio trust. What was once an unregulated technology would now come under the strict command and control of a federal agency. The rise of the AT&T-NBC model led directly to this transformation. Through most of the 1920s, the regulation of American radio had been light, with Hoover's vision of voluntary virtue resting on the hope goodwill made formal rules unnecessary. With networking and advertising the new keys to financial viability, however, the larger broadcasters and manufacturers of radio sets had no use for government even-handedness. They wanted, rather, a government policy that would aggressively favor commercial broadcasting. It may seem surprising to regard Hoover as a naive idealist, but in this context that's what he was. The companies that had, while small and dependent on the sale of radio sets, been perfectly happy with Hoover's rule, now launched an attack on his authority. In 1926, Eugene McDonald, president of both the National Association of Broadcasters and the Zenith Corporation, accused the president of, quote, one-man control of radio, end quote, and called Hoover a, quote, supreme czar, end quote. Deliberately flouting Hoover's rules, McDonald began using frequencies reserved for Canadians, provoking a potential fight with the British Empire. Hoover had no choice but to order him to stop, but McDonald sued to challenge Hoover's right to do so, and a federal district court found that Hoover all along had lacked any authority to assign radio frequencies at all. It was in the wake of Hoover's defeat that, in 1927, Congress saw the need to create the Federal Radio Commission, a congressional agency of enormous importance in our broader narrative, as the only body dedicated to the problems of communication in the United States. Unfortunately, the FRC was tainted from the beginning, its policy closely wedded to the interests of NBC and the Navy. Congress's prime concern in forming it seems to have been denying Hoover, already a promising aspirant to the presidency, too much power over broadcasting, hence the creation of an independent commission as opposed to an authority in the Commerce Department. They might equally have sought to set up a commission with a public service mandate like the BBC's, or even one to preserve the diversity of radio broadcasting, but they did neither, instituting instead only a new bureaucracy, widely seen as captured at birth. After a period of difficulty finding staff, the FRC, founded to favor general broadcasting, almost immediately set about jackbooting its way where Hoover had tread so lightly. Hoover had pictured himself as a careful gardener, trying to cultivate commercial, educational, and other nonprofit radio stations on the same dial. The FRC saw its mission as more to plow up the radio dial, making way for a bigger, better radio of the future. In effecting its program of clearing the airwaves, the agency relied on a new distinction between so-called general public service and propaganda stations. These were, in effect, synonyms for large and small, respectively, but it was apparently easier to assault the underdog if one could label him a propagandist, even though the word didn't have quite as much weight as we now ascribe to it until it was used to describe communications in Nazi Germany. In any case, by whatever name, the FRC favored the large, networked stations affiliated with NBC and later CBS. Because the large operators had superior equipment and fuller and more varied schedules, the FRC could claim not implausibly that they better served the public. As the commission would soon announce, quote, "There is not room in the broadcast band for every school of thought, religious, political, social, and economic, each to have its own separate broadcast stations, its mouthpiece to the ether." So declared the commission in the course of shutting down a well-known station in Kansas famous for its medical quackery. What is immediately striking about this pronouncement is how much it reads like a calculated antithesis of the First Amendment. Less visceral analysis reveals it to be based on a false technological premise. It's true that interference was a problem. Without any order of the radio dial, no station could be heard. But the FRC had a real choice of whether to back more low-powered stations or fewer high-powered stations. There was, in fact, room on the broadcast band for every school of thought, if broadcast rights were confined to localities and low-wattage transmitters. It was simply a matter of how one envisioned dividing up the ether. The FRC's views closely aligned with RCA, NBC, and the rest of the industry, which now depended not on more radio stations but on huge audiences for just a few stations. Government's mission had become to free up frequencies, to make room for stations that could reach huge areas or the whole nation at once, so-called clear channels. With its General Order No. 32, the FRC demanded that 164 smaller stations show cause why they ought not to be abolished. The Commission went further with General Order No. 40, which reset the entire radio dial, shuttering or reducing hundreds of small stations to create 40 nationwide clear channels and cramming the remaining 600 channels into 50 leftover frequencies. Following No. 40, writes Robert McChesney, quote, U.S. broadcasting rapidly crystallized as a system dominated by two nationwide chains supported by commercial advertising, end quote. Commissioner Lafont described it as the structure or very foundation of American broadcasting. And indeed it was. And yet, there was much to be said in defense of the new. The networks of the 1930s can be credited with creating a broad listenership for quality programming, such as the famous radio serials of the period. Reflecting the AT&T ideal of enlightened monopoly, perhaps, the networks also carried some sense of public service, with every station, in theory, a trustee of the public airwaves. So, in addition to the entertainment designed to sell products, the networks broadcast sustaining programs, money losers run in the public interest. From this concept grew their news departments, also unprofitable but serving the public good. By the mid-1930s, it was clear that the cycle had turned in respect to radio, and the medium was completely transformed. The days of the freewheeling American dial were over. In fact, so it was around the world, as virtually every nation began to regulate radio, abandoning the decentralized way of the early American experiment, in many cases without ever having passed through it. The most striking example, of course, were the Germans, who moved directly to the centralized radio model in the 1920s, and by the 1930s had installed radio broadcasting as the centerpiece of the Nazi state's propaganda campaigns. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, saw the radio as a central instrument for achieving Volksgemeinschaft, a German word I can't pronounce, and saw the radio as a central instrument for achieving the unified national community. Quote, a government that has determined to bring a nation together, as he puts it, has not only the right, but the duty to subordinate all aspects of the nation to its goals, or at least ensure that they are supportive. For Goebbels, industrial structure was a critical part of making that happen. Above all, wrote Goebbels, it is necessary to clearly centralize all radio activities. The fate of open radio gives credence to the inevitability of the cycle. Yet we can also see how much of what happened was a matter of choice. There were some attractive features of early American radio worth preserving, and they could have been preserved given less heavy-handed support of the new paradigm. But the defenders of those virtues, Hoover and a few senators, lacked the political clout to prevent a wholesale flip from an open to a closed system. The American government ended up failing to affirm a considered vision of what broadcasting should be, only following and accommodating the evolution of business models. Once the industry had concluded that its profits could be maximized if more people listened to fewer stations, the government, acting as if the business of America were only business, did the industry's bidding, showing only the most feeble awareness of its consequences for the American ideal of free expression. As the years went by, the founder of the commercial system would begin to credit themselves, and not the amateurs, for the creation of American radio. Sarnoff, as head of RCA and founder of NBC, made himself the defining mogul of American radio. He began spinning vainglorious tales for reporters and historians that he had been first to envision radio broadcasting in 1914, that the Dempsey Bout broadcast had been his idea, that he had pioneered the National Broadcasting Network. The amateur hobbyists and inventors like Lee DeForest, even AT&T for that matter, were brushed out of the official portrait, as Sarnoff proceeded like the ancient Chinese emperors who rewrote history as soon as they came to power, to prove they had had heaven's mandate all along. This episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin is brought to you by CryptoKit.com, the easiest, fastest way to send Bitcoins right from your browser. That's KryptoKit.com if you'd like to learn more. Today's magic word is dreams. That's DREAMS. Dreams. You've got until the 31st of December to visit letstalkbitcoin.com or the Let's Talk Bitcoin iPhone app and enter it for your share of the listener rewards. Back to the show. This is part 7 of Radio Dreams, a selected reading from the book The Master Switch written by Tim Wu, brought to you by the folks at Let's Talk Bitcoin. FM radio. In the year 1934, Edwin Armstrong was at the height of his career in every sense. From a laboratory at the very top of the new Empire State Building in New York, with an antenna attached to the spire, Professor Armstrong was testing a new radio technology, firing radio waves at receivers dozens of miles away. The signal was clear and clean, producing an audio fidelity beyond anything heard before. Actual measurements, writes Lauren Lessig, a radio historian, showed clear reception out to at least 3 horizons, or a distance of about 80 miles. Armstrong called his invention frequency modulation radio, or FM for short. The man who put Armstrong in the Empire State Building was David Sarnoff, whom we met ringside at the Dempsey fight 14 years earlier. Sarnoff was then an ambitious young executive obsessed with new technologies such as radio broadcasting. By now, as president of the Radio Company of America, the nation's most important radio manufacturer and parent company of NBC, the preeminent broadcast network, Sarnoff was the single most powerful man in American broadcasting, the defining mogul of an information industry whose importance was comparable only to that of Theodore Vail, Adolf Zukor, and very few others. As such, he was also a symbol of the mass culture redefining American sensibilities. As for Professor Edwin Armstrong of Columbia, he was a different archetype, one of the lone inventors who had long sustained the American approach to inventing. Working in his attic in Yonkers, he had already won fame developing 3 fundamental radio technologies: the regenerative circuit, the super regenerative circuit, and the super heterodyne receiver, the first of them while still an undergraduate. He was also something of a lively character, commuting to Columbia on a bright red Indian motorcycle. In the early 1920s, he'd become smitten with Sarnoff's secretary and bought a French sports car, driving her away in it. Another time, in manic glee, he climbed the 400-foot radio tower on the roof of radio station WJZ in Midtown, New York. Above all, Armstrong was a fervent radio idealist, for whom the technology would always seem magical and of unlimited potential. As fellow early radio enthusiasts, Armstrong and Sarnoff had bonded on February 1st, 1914, having spent a whole night picking up radio signals using Armstrong's technologies. For years, Armstrong would send Sarnoff a telegraph on the anniversary of that day. Armstrong, in fact, owed his substantial fortune to Sarnoff, who in the 1920s had persuaded RCA to buy Armstrong's patents. In the early days, it was possible then for both an inventor and a businessman to inhabit the camp of radio utopianism. Sometime in the 1920s, Sarnoff had tasked Armstrong to design a little black box that might remove the static and distortions of AM radio. Armstrong had taken the direction, and now nearly a decade later, he delivered, though his solution was not a black box, but a new technology of transmitting radio waves. Duly impressed with the results, Sarnoff installed his own friend at RCA's expense in the Empire State Building, the tallest building in the world, ordering that Armstrong be provided with anything he needed to perfect the technology. Yet, as time passed and the encouraging test results continued to mount, Armstrong noticed something strange. He had given Sarnoff an exclusive look at FM both out of personal loyalty and because the sale of his last patent to RCA had granted the firm an option on his next one. And what he had produced went well beyond what had been asked. Indeed, his innovation would give RCA the opportunity to take radio to its full potential. It would never occur to him that the Radio Corporation of America would want to do anything less. And yet, the better the test proved FM to be, the more distant and evasive RCA's management seemed to become. As months passed, Armstrong grew impatient for an answer. Was RCA interested in the commercial development of FM radio or not? Still receiving only vague demur, one day late in 1934 he confronted Sarnoff in Rockefeller Center. Quote, "Why are you pushing this so hard?" asked Sarnoff. "There is a depression on," said Armstrong. "The radio industry needs something to put life in it. I think this is it." "Yes," said Sarnoff, "but this is no ordinary invention. This is a revolution." That was all Sarnoff would say. Armstrong again pressed him, but Sarnoff changed the subject. Armstrong returned to his lab and carried on with his tests until he was politely asked to remove all of his equipment from the Empire State Building. From that day onward, over the next decade, in ways both subtle and not, Sarnoff and the rest of the AM industry quietly campaigned to relegate FM radio to irrelevancy. Three important waves of innovation followed the great consolidation of broadcasting in the 1920s. Mechanical television, electronic television, and FM radio transmission. And despite the importance of each technology, what is so striking is that none managed to produce an independent industry capable of challenging the dominant radio trust, comprising primarily RCA, NBC, and NBC's industrial allies, CBS, General Electric, and Westinghouse. Over 2 decades, from 1926 to 1946, each invention and the inventor behind it would fall victim to David Sarnoff in the radio industry. Sarnoff's story is perhaps this book's most compelling parable on the Kronos effect. And what bears most attention is the power of his particular methods. For while Vail and Zucker consolidated industries by means of financial pressure and corporate acquisition, Sarnoff managed his empire by using government to restrict inventions, and hence the future. In pursuit of this aim, the Radio Trust perfected the art of controlling both public discourse and federal regulation to the detriment of any would-be rivals. They grew to recognize a truth that had eluded Western Union in the 1880s. The best antidote to the disruptive power of innovation is overregulation. That is to say, the industry learned how to secure the enactment of seemingly innocuous and sensible regulations that nonetheless spelled doom for any rival. In fact, a careful review of the 1930s makes clear that the entire FCC was among the most useful tools of domination that industry has ever invented. This is part 8 of Radio Dreams, a selected reading from The Master Switch, a book written by Tim Wu that I highly recommend you go out and buy. Today's reading continues our exploration of the history of FM radio. Why wasn't Sarnoff, once a radio idealist himself, interested in FM? What Sarnoff wanted when he asked for a black box was something that would improve AM radio. But the creative muse has its own agenda. And what Armstrong wound up developing was no improvement on AM, but a replacement for it. FM radio was, in other words, a quintessential disruptive innovation, and whoever Sarnoff may once have been, By the 1930s, he was a man who could ill afford to embrace a disruption of the AM radio economy, and in particular, the NBC system. Now, one must appreciate just how important a development FM was, both technologically and in respect to its potential to revolutionize radio broadcasting. Most of us know that FM is capable of a far higher fidelity in sound reproduction than AM. It's a matter of less static. In the 1930s, when it first appeared, FM was capable of signal-to-noise ratios of 100-to-1 or better, as compared to 30-to-1 for AM stations. But perhaps even more innovative was FM's capability to broadcast using far less power than AM, thus obviating the high-wattage stations controlled by a few broadcasters. If managed correctly, Armstrong realized the adoption of FM could clear the way for many more broadcasters than the large networks dominating the AM dial. Let out of its box, there was even some possibility that FM could make the FCC less relevant, as America returned to a lightly regulated, decentralized industry that was the original vision in the 1920s for this medium. Beyond radio, FM technology held another promise. As a potential competitor to AT&T's long-distance lines, the most powerful communications network in the world. In the late 1930s, Armstrong experimented with small mountaintop relay stations to connect FM stations in different cities. If FM could connect radio stations, networks like NBC could potentially no longer need AT&T's long lines to ferry their programming around the nation. Finally, Armstrong also believed that FM had applications for much more than just broadcasting music or news. At one eye-popping demonstration at his Empire State Building laboratory in 1934, he showed RCA that FM could carry a facsimile reproduction of the New York Times, and telegraph messages as well, a form of wireless fax. In other words, Armstrong foresaw not just better radio, but a multi-purpose communications technology. While it may sound astonishing, even in our own time, the full potential of FM radio remains untapped. And here's a footnote. As of 2010, the Federal Communications Commission was interested in licensing more low-powered FM radio stations, yet Congress, under pressure from broadcasters, passed the Radio Broadcast Preservation Act of 2000, which made the licensing of low-power stations much more difficult. You might think that the possibility of more radio stations with less interference would be generally recognized as a clear good. More radio stations means more choice for the consumers and more opportunities for speakers, musicians, and other performers. But by this point, the radio industry, supported by the federal government, had invested heavily in the status quo of fewer stations. Radio's business model, as we've seen it, was essentially, quote, entertainment that sells. Shows produced by advertisers, with revenues dependent on maximizing one share of the listenership. Hence, the fewer options, the better. Even the preeminent radio manufacturer, RCA, was not immune to this logic. More stations might mean more radio sold, but as owner of NBC, RCA now viewed the network's interest as synonymous with its own. And so we see another instance of how vertical integration of an industry creates a vested interest in limiting free expression. Profit is tied not to the proliferation of many voices, but the propagation of few to the mass production of speech, as it were. The campaign against FM radio in the 1930s and 1940s is a study in rhetoric as a weapon of industrial war. While it changed over time, the strategy pursued by Sarnoff and his allies was to belittle FM, talk down, and generally promote a conventional wisdom that favored the AM industry. It shows, as we shall see, that perhaps the most effective way to gain power over the future is to dictate popular assumptions. RCA and other broadcasters did so by focusing on the promise of a new medium, television. The technology of FM was rarely mentioned in the radio industry's endless promotion of the latest and greatest. When mentioned at all, FM, lauded as theoretically interesting, was also minimized as a mostly unproven technology, experimental and of marginal utility. The message had a strong effect on two audiences. The first of these was the federal government. The government can act only on the basis of what it understands to be established fact. Much of what is called lobbying must actually be recognized as a campaign to establish, as conventional wisdom, the quote, right facts. Whether pertaining to climate change, the advantages of charter schools, or the ideal technology for broadcasting. Much of the work of Washington lobbyists is simply an effort to control the conversation surrounding an issue, and new technologies are no exception. The facts, as the FCC was given to understand them, were that FM might eventually be a useful improvement on AM, but that its time had not yet come. And so, for 6 years after its invention, the FCC banned commercial FM broadcasting and limited experimental FM to a single, narrow, high-frequency band. In contrast to the early, unregulated days of AM radio, there was no way for an FM station even to get started without breaking the law. And even if one were so bold, with no radio manufacturer selling FM sets to consumers, there were no listeners. And without listeners, there was no industry. Investors were the other target of the industry's indoctrination program. Compounding a general scarcity of investment capital in the 1930s, rules banning commercial FM made it all the harder for would-be stations to attract investors. In fact, the very first FM radio stations were non-profit ventures financed by Columbia University at Armstrong's urging, a precursor to Stanford's funding of the Google search engine in the 1990s. Only thanks to Armstrong's tireless advocacy did the technology not die entirely, and indeed begin to gain acceptance, including, eventually, allocation of spectrum for commercial use. He had a flair for the dramatic, and his demonstrations of FM's wonders made headlines, undermining the efforts of the industry to suggest that there wasn't much to it. In 1935, he shocked the Institute of Radio Engineers with a low-powered FM broadcast from Yonkers of remarkably high fidelity. Quote, "A glass of water was poured before the microphone in Yonkers. It sounded like a glass of water being poured, and not, as in the sound effects of ordinary radio, like a waterfall." By such enthusiastic efforts, Armstrong managed to convince a few like-minded people to found FM stations, and by 1941, yielding to the technological reality, the FCC allocated spectrum between 50 and 60 megahertz. But, as mentioned, the disinformation campaign's trump card was television, and the radio trust's insistence that it, not FM, was the future. Many standard histories, in fact, ascribe the slow development of FM to the rise of television. Of course, there's no denying that television was the greater leap, but insofar as television never has supplanted radio, the radio trust was presenting a false choice. There was no reason for the federal government not to allow the development of both a new FM radio industry and a television industry, except, in the industry's tail spinning, it never was a matter of one or the other. The Second World War put the development of all consumer technologies on hold, even though FM did see adoption by the Army and Navy, to whom Armstrong extended a free license to his patents. FM's best chance to become what some had called a radio's second chance would not come until immediately after the war, when the coast was finally clear for commercial use and the new technology gained the grudging support of even RCA-NBC, or at least parts of RCA, which knew its utility all along and now wanted its share. Yet, it can be no coincidence that in 1945 the SEC would also move to enact new rules, ostensibly for the benefit of the FM industry, yet much favored by the AM dial. Above all, NBC and CBS, the broadcast duopoly. That year, the FCC announced that the FM spectrum band would be moved from its original 50 to 60 MHz home to the now familiar 88.5 to 108 MHz range. The shift came with a few additional rules. At the network's urging, FM radio stations owned by AM stations were required to carry the exact same programming, so-called simulcasting, for the supposed benefit of the American consumer. And all FM networks were obliged to use AT&T's network for long-range broadcasting, precluded from developing their own long-distance lines or carrying long-range broadcasts. New limits were put on the maximum wattage of FM stations, which already required little power, thus neutralizing the advantage in range that FM stations naturally had over AM. The rules stoked controversy and drew heavy opposition from the infant FM industry and its allies. The FCC nevertheless defended them in terms reasonable on their face, but specious under their technical particulars. The band relocation and the wattage limits, for instance, apart from clearing bandwidth for television, were officially justified as protecting FM broadcasts from interference, particularly something called skywave interference, that critics believed to be a boogeyman, but whose existence could never conclusively be disproved. In its defense, the FCC had by now conceded that FM was the superior technology, and described its rules as making it possible for migration from AM. There was a defensible objective in preparing an orderly future for FM, in contrast to AM's undesirably chaotic early days. But even if one assumes benign intentions, federal planning is never a good midwife to a new industry. And less charitably, one must allow that the whole concept of migration was designed so that the existing AM station owners would dominate the FM dial. Indeed, by 1949, 85% of the, quote, new FM station licenses had been extended to AM station owners, who tended to duplicate their AM programming on FM. In other words, the FCC managed to expand capacity while quashing the possibility of new programming and new voices. FCC, in short, would countenance FM only so long as it posed no threat to the powers of the existing industry. Generally, the 1945 FCC order was bad news for the FM industry and the independent elements of AM radio. Its new wattage guidelines made obsolete 400,000 FM radio sets that consumers had already bought and required every FM station to buy a new transmitter. Officially, the FCC estimated that the effects of the order would set FM back 4 months. But despite the exertions of Armstrong and the fledgling industry to stay afloat, FM would not recover from these blows for decades. The existing technology developed under the auspices of the industry in 1934, its technological superiority notwithstanding, was effectively dead by 1952. In 1940, Armstrong had predicted that FM would supplant AM in 5 years. Actually, it would take until the 1970s for it to catch on, and until the 1980s to reach the popularity of AM. It can't be denied that the emergence of television at the same time took some wind out of FM sales, but it's likewise true that wholly replacing one technology with another does take time. But the studied efforts of the AM industry and the complicit restrictions imposed by the FCC, even if occasionally well-meaning, certainly retarded FM, preventing it from developing into anything more than AM and stereo. Its other remarkable capabilities, especially the potential for many new low-cost radio stations or long-distance relays, remains unexploited even to this day. In Lessig's description of what happened, quote, "The vast concentration of economic power that marked the field of mass communications had rolled over FM and crushed it into a shape less threatening to their monopolistic pattern of operation." Professor Armstrong would never see his greatest invention reach mass acceptance, but what finally crushed him has less to do with the burdens of championing FM's struggle and more to do with his personal battle with RCA and David Sarnoff. RCA had begun changing its tune about FM in 1946, when it saw the technology's value for providing sound to television broadcasting. Sarnoff, understanding well the merits of Armstrong's invention, decided to put FM receivers in RCA's television sets. But instead of seeking the partnership of his old friend, Sarnoff and his firm decided to simply use Armstrong's technology and wait for him to sue. RCA's official position was that its in-house engineers had invented and patented a, quote, different FM. In reality, there was no such thing, and Armstrong, like Alexander Bell in the 1870s, was forced into litigation that would last the rest of his life. Unfortunately, though he was extremely stubborn, Armstrong was facing an opponent that was ready for him. RCA's lawyers from the firm of Cahill Gordon did what New York law firms specialize in, turning lawsuits into wars of attrition. It was a fight of man against corporation, with discovery and pretrial motions artfully employed to delay justice until the size of Armstrong's legal bills alone threatened to determine the contest. The inventor's deposition alone lasted over a year. It was during this litigation that Sarnoff and Armstrong came face to face for what's almost certainly the last time. Sarnoff was deposed by his own lawyers with Armstrong at the plaintiff's table. Then, Armstrong's lawyer asked Sarnoff how the men knew each other, and Sarnoff, with perfect Sangfried, replied, quote, "We were close friends. I hope we still are." Later, when RCA's lawyers asked him who had invented FM radio, Sarnoff expanded on the party line. Quote, "I will go further and I will say that the RCA and the NBC," he testified, "have done more to develop FM than anybody in this country, including Armstrong." The denial that Armstrong had in fact invented FM was, if not the last straw, then very nearly the last. A man's decision to end his life is inevitably a complex one, and cannot easily be blamed on one person or event. Yet it's clear that by the 1950s, whatever faith Armstrong had in the fairness of the system, of business, of justice, and of life itself was being chipped away by the travails of FM, which he had made his own. He was nearly bankrupted, as the lawsuit with RCA consumed the once great fortune from his earlier patents. His marriage to Sarnoff's one-time secretary had also fallen to pieces over his refusal to settle. In 1954, it all became too much to bear. On February 1st, 40 years to the day from the night he and Sarnoff had spent searching from radio signals, he wrote a final note, dressed neatly, and walked out the window of his 13th floor Manhattan apartment. The story of FM radio gives some taste of what television's inventors were in for, and a sense of David Sarnoff's genius in the art of industrial combat. He saw not just that FM could replace AM, but that television would more generally replace radio, and by implication destroy the Radio Corporation of America. He was a man who proved it is possible to defy both Joseph Schumpeter's doctrine of creative destruction, and, as he turned RCA into a television company, the adage that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Thanks for listening to episode 173 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Content for today's show was provided by Adam B. Levine. Music for this episode was provided by Jared Rubens. This episode was edited by Adam B. Levine. See you in 2015.